Ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this edition of Nextier Development Discourse. I think today we are discussing an issue that is very pertinent to every Nigerian, not just because it's something we are currently facing, but because it has to do with a topic that most Nigerians, most Africans are interested in, the issue of arms disarmament. Why this is very important again is that this week is marked by the UN as the Arms Disarmament Week. So we felt it was important that we look at those issues affecting Nigeria and affecting the African region as regards violent conflict and insecurity. For instance, today in Nigeria, we are faced with the issue of terrorism, banditry, secession agitation, maritime piracy. We are faced with the issue of cultism and government attack all over. What it means is that government by the day is working its socks off to find a way to curtail the level of illicit arms flowing into the country. Not only on that part, there are a lot of organizations who are on their own working on a way to find a pathway to reintegrate people who are affected by these small arms and light weapons, in one way or the other. So as part of this discourse, we'll be looking at not only what government is doing, we're actually looking at what the non-state actors, especially international organizations, are doing in trying to solve this menace that is ravaging the entire continent. I will be discussing this with experts, not just experts, people whose life almost depend on what they are doing to safeguard the society and find a pathway to making our society safe. My name is Ndu Mwokolo. I'm a managing partner with Nextier. I manage Nextier's business unit that has to do with security, peace, and development. As most of you know us, Nextier is a multi-competency international development firm that works in the area of power sector, security, peace, and development, public service advisory, as well as energy transition. So a lot of people might be asking, why is Nextier interested in this? If you don't have a safe society, you will never have a growing economy. The two are interrelated. So that's why we are doing this. We are doing this to know that, to start a kind of building confidence back into the society and see a pathway to solving most of these problems. With me today are the experts I've mentioned, but let me find a way to introduce them. They have a lot of CVs, but I'll find a way to make it as short as possible. I will start with a man whose role is to find a way to get the small arms and light people off our streets. The way he is going to do it or the way he does it, part of it he will be explaining to us. This morning we are welcoming General Alba Diko. General Diko was commissioned into Nigerian Army in 1986. He has done his 35 years, retired, but has taken another role. He's now the National Coordinator, National Center for Small Arms and Light Weapons. Before then, one role that he did, a lot of people knew, was when he was the theater commander for Operation Lafayette in the northeast part of the country. General Diko, I'm not going to go into your CV, there's just so much. Welcome to this morning's development discourse. Let me move to the next panelist, Juliana. Juliana currently serves as the IOM Nigeria DDR program manager. He oversees disengagement, disassociation, reintegration, and reconciliation program for IOM. I'm sure we know what IOM is. IOM, International Organization for Migration, which is another big UN agency that is working to find a way to integrate people either caught up in armed conflict or people who whose migration path hasn't really led to what they wanted to do. So before coming to Nigeria, he has experience working in Colombia. Interesting. So probably we might hear some of the things she has to tell us about working in Colombia and in Nigeria now. Currently, she's working in Borno, helping the federal government the government of the three Bay states, that is Borno, Adamawa, and Yobe, in finding a way of implementing the DDR-related processes. Juliana, welcome to our Nextier Development Discourse. Last but not the least is Eric. Eric, let me first say that Eric is a friend of Nigeria because he knows so much based on the work he has been doing around area of small arms and light weapons. He's currently the founder and director of Safeguarding Security Sector, S4 Initiative, and also a scholar, just like me, a scholar at the African program, study at Northwestern University in the US. Before then, he has worked with a lot of organizations and have published widely as well. So, Eric, you published widely, and I'm going to start reading most of them because I'm sure people will come back to us to share some of your bio who will want to contact you personally. So I will want to stop here, considering that we have a lot to discuss and we'll have just an hour, 30 minutes to do this. So what I'm going to do is to give each panelist 30 minutes to do an introduction, an overview of the complexity of arms and armed disarmament in Nigeria and in the continent. That will be the introduction. And then for our audience, please keep sending in your question. We'll collect all the questions and direct it to the appropriate panelists to answer them. Where we think you must be brought on board and you will have time, we'll open up for people to ask questions directly. So I'm going to start with Gerardico. Gerardico, can we get your introduction remark on the issue we are looking at today?
Good morning, Ndu and other panelists, Eric, Juliana. It's a pleasure to be on to you and to be part of this very important discourse. By way of introduction, even though it's been mentioned already, my name is Major General Abba Mohammed Diko, retired, and currently I have the National Center for the Control of Small Arms and Light Weapons, which is an agency that was established precisely 2 years, 9 months ago by the government of Nigeria. This is not to say that there has not been an institutional framework that seeks to address issues related to small arms and light weapons control in Nigeria. What has happened is that in line with the requirements of the ECOWAS Commission and also in trying to hit the nods of the United Nations Program of Action on small arms and light weapons, there was a requirement for the governments of each member state of ECOWAS to have an independent institution that seeks to address this problem. And as such, the government in its wisdom decided to set up this center as an offshoot of what used to be the Presidential Committee on Small Arms and Light Weapons, which was an ad hoc arrangement. So over the years, there has been attempts by the government to address this issue, but in a more of an ad hoc arrangement rather than an institutional, approach to it. So the issues relating to liaison with key stakeholders was quite absent, and that created so much gap in trying to address this problem. So I think what we've tried to do in the last 2 years and a half, precisely, is to see how we can become more visible, both nationally and also extend our outreach to be a partner with the ECOWAS Commission, and then at the same time to tap into the all other initiatives that are out there, especially from the UN system, and also at the bilateral level. We've tried to see how we can galvanize a concerted effort with our neighboring countries so that we can key and tap into existing early warning systems, existing intelligence fusion units, and existing collaborative efforts across various instruments. And that is what we're trying to do in order to now become more mainstreamed into the problem. So you see, now we're talking about 200 million plus people and a huge space. And so it's not going to be an easy task in trying to understand the complexities that comes with the issues of small arms and light weapons, because within this space where 200 million people are, there are different types of, our internal security dynamics. So, and so that has shaped the perception of the average citizen on what is the meaning of individual security, collective security, and what is the responsibility of the citizens vis-a-vis the responsibility of government and other stakeholders in, trying to expatiate on the need or otherwise of self-protection, individual protection, individual security, community, security and protection. So, but be that as it may, the perception also about the profiling, dynamics of our society. And so you have all sort of identity crisis in trying to, link the desire for arms possession to a certain social or socio-political and demographic, a setting. In those early days, we used to talk about, farmers and herders clash, which clearly profiles a, key element of the society, farmers and herders. And so then other dynamics came in, and now you begin to have banditry, you begin to have terrorists, you begin to have kidnappers, you begin to have, all sorts, vigilante, and all whatnot. So there is, this complex, environment where the effort of government and effort of institutions like ours has to, really key into it in order to assist, the understanding that the responsibility for individual security, collective security, people's security is that of government, and that is what government is doing. But at the same time, it requires that, people, the citizenry, are stakeholders in this drive. And as such, this is, by way of introduction, what I want to bring into this. But again, in context to our discourse today, and you can now begin to imagine what landscape that is there for you to bring a framework that removes this weapon from circulation, these weapons from circulation from the hands of people who have seen it one either as a tool for self-defense or as a tool for agitation or as a tool for establishing some kind of right or over a space, over an issue, or over a people. So that is what I can say by way of introductory remarks as we join this program. And thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you. Let me move over to you, Juliana. You're doing a lot, especially in the Northeast. So some of us who work with you know what you're doing, but can you tell Nigerians what exactly IOM have been doing?
Thank you very much, Nuran. Thank you very much for all the panelists today for joining us. First of all, allow me to say I'm very happy to see a panel where we are connecting the D to the DR, and in some cases the DDRR as in Nigeria, because usually we have the conversation separated. We talk about the disarmament, and in a different, like if it's a different context, we talk about the demobilization and reintegration, or in the case of Nigeria, disengagement, disassociation, reintegration and reconciliation. Nigeria and the Lake Chad Basin, actually. So I think it's good that, and we are very happy to be seated in this table today. They are, of course, other sister agencies of the UN who work also in disarmament. UNDP has the mandate, but as you mentioned, we have worked a lot on DDR. Not only in Nigeria, but overall, we have more than 25 years working in DDRR in IOM. So our overall mandate is to promote regular and safe migration. In Nigeria, we have our migration management work, which is focused on counter-trafficking, promoting regular migration, supporting those students, workers that want to migrate to other countries for work. We also have our emergency work, particularly in the Northeast, as response to the crisis of the violent extremism. And we have the DDRR program. So in Nigeria, we started our program in 2017 as part of the support to the federal government and Operation Safe Corridor, which is the federal program for rehabilitation and reintegration. Our program works on our regional strategy. So we have implementation also in Chad, Niger, and Cameroon, because these are all the regions affected by the Boko Haram and ISWAP crisis. So the approaches and the methodology that we support and the government approach that we try to support, it comes on a coordinated approach for the 4 Lake Chad Basin countries. This is aligned with the Lake Chad Basin Commission work, and of course, other stakeholders, including UN agencies, INGOs, NGOs, and civil society. Our programming goes through 4 main pillars. The first one is, as I mentioned, government capacity support, the legal frameworks. In Nigeria, we have the prevention and countering violent extremism policy. Under the policy, we have the National DDR Action Plan, which is a plan but not a policy. Now, ONSA, led by ONSA, started a conversation with the states to think about going broader from their plan. And then all the assessments that we have done to support successful reintegration in the communities. Our second component of work is focused on direct support to the rehabilitation programming. As I mentioned, Operation Safe Corridor activities, mostly in preparation for reintegration, whether the former associates back to the communities. The third component is what IOM has developed and named information counseling and referral system management. So this is a methodology that IOM has been working on for the last 25 years, which support individual case management for the former associates. So basically, it's a team of staff that follow us and support each of the former associates that return to the communities so that we can guarantee that actually the process is sustainable and there's no recidivism. And the last but not least, more important component is all the reconciliation work with the communities for them to support and monitor their integration process and be sure that that is successful, that there's enough information on how the process works, that there's enough sensitization when reintegration is happening. This is the model in Nigeria right now, and as I mentioned, in other countries, we work very closely with other UN agencies, UNICEF, UNODC, and UNDP mainly, and of course, mostly on the 3 Bay states. But as the general mentioned, Nigeria, and the dynamics in the Lake Chad Basin are very complex. And now we're seeing in the Northeast, in the Northwest, in the North Central, banditry, farmers and herders. So IOM also is involved in supporting especially community resilience and social cohesion to promote a successful reintegration and community violence reduction activities. So very happy to be here, and thank you for the invitation.
Sure, thank you so much. Let's move over to Eric. Eric.
Thank you. So yeah, I'm pleased to be here and have this opportunity to learn from the host, from my panelists, and from the audience. I always find these types of gatherings enriching and a learning experience. Many of you in the audience will know me from the 20 years I spent at the Small Arms Survey, before that with the UN and some other things. But for the last 2 years, I've been the director of the Safeguarding Security Sector Stockpiles Initiative. And what I want to underscore there is that that sounds like it's arms control focused, and that's an element of it. But the message here is that if we focus purely on the problem of illicit arms proliferation as a arms control matter, we will make only limited progress. And that's a problem because the development community, the counterterrorism community, the security sector governance community, we all work in silos. And so how do we break that down, and how do we work together? And that won't be done just in the next 90 minutes, but it's important to have the conversation. And I'm excited that General Dicko is here because I worked very closely with his predecessor, and the resources he and his team have are so much greater, and there's so much opportunity there as they're much more integrated across the country. In terms of the topic of today, I think it's a good sign about the title, Complexities. It's a tremendous challenge, and we've already touched on in General Dicko's opening remarks as some of the challenges, and Juliana's as well. I would simply say that in my remarks today, I will be talking about S4's work in Nigeria and the Lake Chad Basin region. And what I want to underscore here, and I'll underscore in my talk, is that the challenges and some of the efforts to address these challenges are not limited to Nigeria. They're sub-regional and continental, and that there's a lot that can be learned from Nigeria's efforts to combat these challenges. And so I'm really looking forward to the Q&A, and thank you very much, moderator, for inviting me to participate.
Thank you, Eric. So I'm going to cash in on your last your last statement to ask a question that I think I want to say it's only General Dicko that can answer it. Some of us, or some Nigerians, they are the obvious ones they know, which are impediments to the work you do. So what are the ones that they don't know that only you and people that work with you know, and which you think Nigerians should know, or that other development partners who might want to work with you in what you're doing should know? What are these impediments to this arms disarmament in Nigeria?
Thank you very much. I think it's not a knowledge that is limited to me alone. Eric is half Nigerian. He's been so much known about. So I think you would also be able to contribute to that. Juliana, I think it's a pleasure to finally, put a face to the name. But I think we have a lot to do together in trying to understand the context of disarmament within our space here. And I wouldn't want to make it look as an impossible task. It is a difficult task because we are at this point, there is a level of awareness that is just beginning to pitch people on the side of the requirement to have arms for the purpose of self-defense. And this is not only happening to individuals. You can begin to see that within some formal arrangements, government institutions are beginning to put quasi-security arrangements in place in order to address security challenges within their domain. And in doing that, it is escalating the problem associated with disarmament as a whole. So while looking at communities and individuals as target audience in order to draw them into this initiative and draw them into voluntary, surrender or handover of their weapons, you have on the other side, an institutional framework that seeks to give limited capacity for self-defense to quasi-security arrangements. So that begins to expand the framework for which disarmament programs has to be conceptualized. And I would like to work with you in particular IOM, on this, so that we can look at your, what are your programs of action and see how we can localize it. What do I mean by localize? How we can make it to become a flexible and applicable, a plan to different, contextual issues. Now, when you talk about impediment, the first thing is the mindset. What is the need for arming yourself, or what is the need for arming a society? And so where you have an escalation of crisis, escalation of security dynamics, security problems, it now begins to call for the necessity for protection, for self-defense. And so it is the mindset. The first thing is the psyche of the person who you want to capture into a disarmament program. The trust deficit that is there, because the thinking is there is no sufficient measures in place to guarantee protection. So what are those, efforts, that are visible, that are tangible, that you can feel, that can guarantee, safety, security, and return to normal life? I used to say that security is the responsibility of the people. The people make the security agencies and security outfits. We are all products of the people. We are all from these communities, from the societies that make the space Nigeria. Therefore, whether you are an identified security agent or you are just an ordinary citizen, you are part of the security architecture. And as such, the discourse is not about the expert, which by this I mean the security agent, putting his template over a society, over a people, without contribution from the people. So the second impediment is a gap, the gap between the effort of government institutions and other stakeholders and the people. Now, we must raise awareness. We must bring on board all the stakeholders, civil societies, traditional institutions, faith-based organizations, the youth group, and so many other stakeholders to understand that this is an exercise that should be a whole of people approach. Now, oftentimes we say a whole of nation. When you say a whole of nation, you're talking about cluster of institutions. But if you say a whole of people, it removes artificial barriers, and it brings about the understanding that every soul, every citizen, whether he belongs to an organized sector or an informal sector, is a stakeholder in this process. So that is, again, another thing which we have to, because we are not in a state of war. So you are not seeing visible warring parties that you are going to bring on board a negotiation table to say this is a peace agreement and this is the content of the peace agreement. So it's very difficult. Here people are talking about self-defense. Of course, you can look at the criminal elements within the society that think the instrument of the use of gun is the only approach or the only means by which they can meet their own socio-economic needs. It's because they are completely, out of tune with basic knowledge about how to harness their own resources. So when you take a bandit, for instance, or a kidnapper, for instance, who thinks that it is by the use of the gun that he can be able to, kidnap people and then make his socio-economic breakthrough. Now, what are the alternatives? Those alternatives is what they left off because they have found a quicker method and a quicker means by which they can meet their socio-economic needs. So you see there is a psychological problem from somebody moving away from legitimate means to criminality. So when you talk about impediments to disarmament, you have to deal with this kind of mindset. The gun is my power, is my source of strength, is what makes me to be the revered, the so honored, so elevated, so deeply entrenched individual in a community, in a society, in a space. So when you look at some of these, the impediments are not the textbook impediments that you can always say, oh, well, you have you need to look at the conditionalities that has been put in paper, the template, and so you are obliged to meet these demands before you can go into a full-scale disarmament process. And as I've always said, you cannot look at the security dynamics of an environment and bring a one-cap-fits-all mindset into it. So impediments are diverse, but on the surface, these are the 3-4 key things that cut across. And that is because we are at a stage now where we are having criminal elements that are dominating the space. You are not talking about armed groups that are seeking to engage or to for territorial gains or to establish a governance system or to set up a certain status quo where it is at par with government. No. And that is the issue. Now, when you look at the Northeast, which unfortunately is a situation that is also driven by a confused motive. Most of those who found themselves bearing arms as terrorists did not understand what they were bearing the arms for. And once they got involved in it, it became difficult for them to extricate themselves because it was initially seen as an ideology based on a certain, faith, a belief system. So now it has metamorphosed into a hydra-headed kind of terrorism with all sorts of elements that are making it to be a more, fluid kind of, terrorism. So criminal elements are operating within this space, and because they are within this space, their criminality is seen as part of terrorism. So again, I came back to the people, and I recall that I had to go on air and I had to throw leaflets into so many ungoverned spaces that it is the people that are the custodian of their security. And if the people decide to say no to the ideology, there will then begin to come a defeat to this so-called menace called terrorism. To a great extent, communities imbibed it, took it away, and the only thing that came out of it was it helped them to relocate so that they can be far away from the influences of this group of people who coerce them into their kind of ideology and belief system. So we'll just leave it at that. But taking it further, should I continue with all the other, questions?
I would have loved that you answer, because you mentioned communities, and somehow if you ask an average Nigerian, he will want to tell you that most of the arms are coming in because of porous borders. But some of us know that some of these communities have industries where these local arms are fabricated.
Yes.
How can we deal with these sort of ones?
Really, again, we have to look at the environment, and I'm looking at a regional, setting. Sub-Saharan Africa, where do you find the most lucrative market today for these small arms and light weapons? Where do you have the affordability? Where do you have the desperation to acquire these things? Most times we say the gates of the armories of Libya were flung open and everything that is there has been shipped down to sub-Saharan Africa. And I ask, is there no conflict today in Libya, and where are they sourcing their weapons from? It is from their own armories. So if 1 million weapons were let loose in Libya, I want to say that 900,000 has been retained in Libya because there is serious internal security crisis in Libya. So we look at what trickles down here and we think it is all that is within our space. There are so many other sources of these weapons. Now, before we come to the issue of local capacity, I think there is an element which is new. And that element I want to share because this is something that I have come to realize, that armed groups pull their weapons together and they trade with it. So if armed group A operating in northwest Nigeria is in their need of, capability, they can liaise with armed group in armed group B in maybe north central Nigeria, and they collect weapons from them so that they can boost their capacity. When they finish doing what they want to do and they are successful, they return the weapons to armed group B with some off-cuts, perhaps, which we will call the loot of whatever they have done successfully. So this is not being factored into our thinking, that there is this circulation of the same weapons within different species for the purpose of supporting one another. So also the issue of the manpower. So armed group A may be in the real sense about 150 to 200 men in strength, but they can get support from armed group B with additional 50 to 100 men in order to boost their strength and capabilities. So this increases circulation within. Now, in terms of open borders, porous borders, it is you and I that is thinking about border. When you go to those places, there is something like a border because there is no line drawn. So the routes that are used in order to bring these things in are free routes. They are not clearly marked routes. The only thing that happens is that at some point, these numerous routes converge at a particular crossing point because there has to be an exchange center. What we have been doing here, which is an intelligence-driven process, is mapping out these routes, identifying the key exchange points. A gun runner A would always meet a gun runner B, and there has to be a meeting point because it is not a freely traded commodity. Therefore, it has to be at a point where it is seen to be safe and secure. And this, you cannot replicate them in so many places because you will now raise a flag. So this is something that when we talk about borders, porous borders, I am looking at numerous routes, both within and with our neighboring countries. And we've had occasions where we've shared some of the routes with our neighboring countries. Early this year, we had a multilateral meeting where my counterparts from Niger, from Chad, from Cameroon, from Benin Republic, we sat on the table and we exchanged notes on this routing. And by the way, in a couple of, I think in about 2 weeks from now, we shall be having a roundtable conference in Abuja here. And I think I want to extend invitation to Juliana because IOM, I can't remember signing a letter of invite to IOM. So I'm doing that now, and I'm going to send a letter immediately after this, interaction to your office to invite you to the roundtable, even though it is actually at the behest of Mine Advisory Group, but we are also partnering with them so that we can do that. Eric, are you in town or you are out so that we can get you on board as well?
You'll share with me the details.
If you are
a meeting in China, but I would be very interested. We'll discuss. Thank you.
Fine, I will share these details with you because it is very important that one of the things that we are looking at, because they are not talking about local fabrication capacities. We've been doing a mapping in order to identify those with the skill set. And you will be amazed at what we have found. Now, the key thing that is required from these local fabricators is a delivery system, a delivery capability that is capable of discharging a normal, cartridge or a projectile. And I have seen a capacity in local fabrication where a 7.62 round of ammunition has been discharged from a locally fabricated weapon using simple material. In fact, I have also seen a local fabricator who has been able to manufacture a revolver pistol that uses 7.62. Normally, a pistol uses 9mm caliber, which is, limited in range and limited in lethality. But here you are, a revolver that discharges 7.62, ammunition. So the ingenuity that comes with this is what the center is trying to harness. Rather than allow these people to be continuously exposed to criminal elements, we're trying to bring them on board and formalize their skill set so that we can mainstream them into the military-industrial complex. We are looking at craftsmanship that can support our needs. At the moment, what we are looking at is how to reduce reliance on importation of this, weapons. And as such, the Defense Industries Corporation that has been, the focal point for our, to spearheading our military industrial capabilities is in the loop as far as this is concerned. But the numbers are huge. Within the North Central Zone alone, we have more than 20,000 of such, local capabilities for, a fabrication of discharge, weapon discharge systems. Because they are just simple tools. They are simple tools that are put together. They know what a trigger is, and they know what a firing pin is, and they know what a barrel is. And most of the material that they are using, especially the shock absorber of a motorbike, withstand all sorts of velocities that you can think of. It doesn't get spoiled. It doesn't get bad.
Yeah, I think you've given us a good context, almost towards the third question I would have asked when I come back from Juliana and Eric.
Yes.
So I'll move to Juliana now to find out. Initially all we knew was DRR. Now we have DDRR. Now you're even talking about reassociation. I think the concepts are growing by the day. To some watchers, it might be difficult to a lot of people might be wondering, how do you kind of move from one of these programs to the other? How do you integrate, reassociate, and all this kind of transition? How do you do it?
Thank you very much, Nuro. And that's actually a very good question, because it's kind of the main mindset that we try to internalize in DDRR is there's not one template and there's no one way of doing it. And it needs to be localized, and it needs to be designed by the local governments, by the state governments, and it needs to be done based on the context. If we try to replicate what we're doing, even from state to state, conflict dynamics are different. I mean, there's many stakeholders are different, challenges are different. So you cannot aim to have the same process, the same approaches, the same methodologies, because it will backfire on you and it will backfire in the process. And I want to bring a couple of things that the general mentioned. The first one is the communities need to be at the center of the process, and the communities need to be aware that and the authorities needs to be aware. If you do this process of, for instance, taking arms out of the context, you can create an increased vulnerabilities in the communities if the process is not done with them. In the case, for instance, where you have actors like CJTF, where you have, for instance, when he mentioned communities that actually depend on the skills that they have acquired around small arms and light weapons control. So it's very important on DDRR that we take into account the context. The second thing is you can implement DDR, and it's happening in several countries in Africa with peacekeeping operations, where there's active involvement of peacekeeping operations of the UN. There's a peace agreement, usually there's a negotiation with the different groups. In the case of Nigeria, for instance, there's no peace agreement, but there's a huge involvement from the governments, federal and states. So that's also, and there's many examples of DDR being implemented in different countries where there's no peace agreement. Colombia, for instance, we started back, we have had different processes of DDR, and we had the first peace process in 2015, after doing reintegration and demobilization for 10 years. And now something that I always mention is you will have around 90,000 people that has gone through a reintegration process in Colombia. Now, Borno state government is reporting around 100,000 people going through it has been called the Borno model, which is a mass surrender, voluntary surrender. And this has happened only in the last 1.5 years. So definitely, if you think, okay, let's implement the same processes that we did in other countries, where the caseload is so big, where you have so many differences in what's happening, it will be a mistake. However, there's lessons learned, and there's things that you can improve and implement based on the context. And this is, for instance, the rehabilitation and reintegration support. So Nigeria, the name, the disengagement, disassociation, reintegration, and reconciliation process comes from the Nigerian government and the federal level saying, for us, it's very important the rehabilitation stage, where you have religious counseling, where you have an important engagement with the religious leaders, promoting interpretations of the Quran and having this conversation with the imams and the religious leader. And this is particularly on the context of the violent extremism in the Northeast. So the name disengagement and disassociation bring this to the context because before we were talking about demobilization of, for instance, guerrillas in Central America. And now, for instance, as you mentioned, there's other state governments that are suggesting to add a D because the disarmament was missing, or add an R to the model. So it changed. It's never the same. For instance, again, an example of Colombia, because I'm biased. They talk. One of the components of the peace agreement was to talk about normalization. The armed group requested, we are not being reintegrated because that happened to the paramilitary groups. We are just normalizing to the civilian life again. And in terms of even the disarmament, some groups will request for laying over their arms. They are not being disarmed. They are laying over their arms. How do you do it? And I agree, is people-centered, and the General, please correct me, but you said people-centered and actually whole-centered approach. There's many, in the case of Nigeria, for instance, MDA is involved, many stakeholders involved. So we start, and there's different stages of DDR. You can start with the community violence reduction activities, right? And it's bringing community dialogue, community sensitization to the communities, even before doing DDR or during or after implementing, for instance, a peace agreement. And it's those activities, theater, sports, dialogue, skills training, involving women. This is very important in terms of evil disarmament, because one of the things when a person is handing over their arm voluntarily as part of a peace agreement or as part of a reduction of our controls in the context is they lose this sense of power. Having an arm give you a sense of power, and that's why it's so important that's feeling of appropriation to the community comes from a process. For instance, along with the community leaders, along with the youth in the communities, that they feel part of the society. But if that feeling remains, that the only connection that they have and the power that they have was because they were appropriating an arm, it will be a challenge for the successful reintegration. So what we do is promote that community engagement, but also include a lot of mental health and psychosocial support, family outreach and community outreach. In the case of violent extremism and former associates, they have been many years engaged to the group. Some of them engaged to the group being minors after being abducted by the group. So when they return back to the communities, they don't have connections with their families. They don't even know where their families is. They are afraid of returning to their community of return. So for instance, we have created a strategy that it's called Social Cohesion and Reconciliation Platforms. And we have worked with other agencies to identify community leaders, youth, members in the communities that are willing to support the reintegration process. So once a person comes back, for instance, from Operation Safe Corridor or now under the Borno model, these communities have been sensitized before, have been receiving information on how the process works, along with, for instance, strategic communications from the government explaining how the process. So I think we need to be open on how this works, so that afraid and that rejection that might come, it's overcome. And you understand reintegration as a second chance, as a second opportunity. And for that, you need to understand, okay, what are the reasons people enroll in the groups, which is, I think, something that we will discuss further in your questions. But yeah, I'll stop now to give my colleagues also.
Okay, so let me move to Eric. Eric, you want to use a slide? Because
I'm only going to use...
because I wanted to find out about the significant challenges that we face around disarmament. How do they differ? Because I know you've worked in some of the African countries apart from Nigeria. So what's the difference? What are the challenges? I had wanted to ask this question, part of the humanitarian question to Juliana, but I'll come back to that. But to you, who has done some policy work, some research work around the Lake Chad region, the Greater African region. So what's this complex is, I don't think they are the same, right? So what are the differences and how can we start solving some of them?
Thank you. If Joshua could put on just one of the slides, I know you'll have a summary of this and people can have the PowerPoint presentation, but in the interest of time, in the interest of leaving sufficient time for Q&A, why don't we just go to Joshua, just the slide on the sub-regional map. Oh, I see you have the power. Yeah, keep on going down. And next. There it is. So that just if you could focus on that. Perfect. So I had planned to put this in context through a series of building blocks to get to this map. Let me jump off or start with General Dicko's comment about the porosity of borders and also what he said about Libya. President Buhari had for years talked about the problems that Nigeria was facing coming from the weapons from the Libyan conflict. And it's true that weapons did flow to Nigeria, to Mali, across the sub-region, but it's not an ongoing problem. He then said about weapons coming from Ukraine, but there I have not been able to learn of any connection, but it was said just before the elections. I think what we have, and General Dicko commented about the circulation within the country of weaponry between armed groups, which is very interesting. I know there was a recruitment angle between the Northwest and the Northeast, and I know that there had been some weapons from the Northeast to the Northwest, but that's something that perhaps in Q&A we can unpack further, but that's very interesting contribution. The dynamics are such that there's been a dearth of focus of weapons seized from state security and from peacekeepers, the forces in these countries that end up arming some of these negative forces. And that's what I wanted to touch on today, because I think that's understudied. In the Lake Chad Basin region in Nigeria, there's been over 500 attacks just in Borno State that S4 has been able to document in Nigeria on attacks on the security forces. And many of these result in the seizure of lethal materiel. This is something, if you look at the map there, you can see that, yes, there's a lot of incidents in Adamawa, Borno, and Yobe, but also in Diffa region in Niger, in the far north of Cameroon, and in Lak region in Chad. So the S4 in its work was able to document more than 1,000 attacks on security forces, and perhaps a quarter of those resulted in the diversion of lethal materiel. But the message here is that it's not a problem limited to Nigeria and the Lake Chad Basin. So you can see that throughout parts of Mali, throughout parts of Burkina Faso, in the northwest of Niger, in Tillaberi and Tahua regions, security forces have also come under attack, and armed groups have been able to secure lethal materiel in this manner. What you don't see in this map is the dynamism of what changes over time. And what's happening is that the problem is becoming more of an issue in the south, the Gulf of Guinea states. So across the border, the southern border with Burkina Faso and Cote d'Ivoire and Togo and Benin, those in the last 18 to 24 months, there have been attacks, and this is going to grow. This is going to become more of a problem in the coming years. In the next couple of months, S4 and its partners will provide a map showing that this is a problem also in the Great Lakes region, in the Greater Horn of Africa region. It's really continental. And it's not limited to small arms and light weapons, but it's also a challenge in terms of the loss of heavy weapon systems, which is a great concern. I was going to talk about arms control frameworks. There may be some people in the audience who are focused on ECOWAS and the Small Arms Convention, which entered into force in 2009. There are stipulations that exist that are legally binding that are not being operationalized as of yet, but maybe we discuss that in Q&A. And I would just like to pick up on the government arming civilians that General Dicko commented on, which is in answer to the question about what's new. It used to be that governments wanted to disarm their civilians, and there was always great support for that. As General Dicko mentioned, there's a new dynamic in which states in Nigeria, but across predominantly now in Burkina Faso, with the Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland, which is 50,000 strong, the state is now arming civilians. And a very interesting question will be what checks and balances are being created for these community defense organizations or security operations to rein in or to promote their security, but not to lose control of the arms that are provided. In the Nigerian context, in the Northeast, they have the Civilian Joint Task Force, which has been operational now for more than 10 years. And a very interesting question is, what are some of the emerging good practices that Nigeria has undertaken to control these arms, to provide training, to provide oversight that can be replicated elsewhere? What didn't work and should not be replicated? What worked but needed more effort? And I think a very interesting question that from the Nigeria context is to provide the lessons learned and the lessons being applied so that other countries in the sub-region and across Africa can benefit from the Nigerian experience. So I hope that you'll be able, that people who are listening can benefit from the more expansive presentation that I provided. But in the interest of time and leaving a half hour for Q&A, let me stop there. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric. So I'll do one more thing, which I'll try to give each of you 2 minutes to try to answer. I'll start with General Dicko, just 2-3 minutes. General Dicko, I know what you said, or there was a research work Nextier did for one of the international partners where we try to map vigilante groups supported by the subnationals. Here, I mean the state government. Part of what we found out is that some of them have arms with no arm control framework, So you see a lot of them littered everywhere. What are you doing about that? Knowing that this mandate is on you. How are you passing the message to them about arming these quasi-security services that they've all floated everywhere?
I think your question actually is, again, is just to further buttress what Eric had, sought to clarify. And I would just say that for want of time, I would have loved to really dilate as much as possible on this, because I operated in a space where the most active and the most organized group, the Civilian Joint Task Force, was operating, and how their operations was within the context of an architecture that did not infringe on the overall effort of the government's, the armed forces, focus in the Northeast. Now, you see, there are advantages and disadvantages in the use of this kind of arrangement. And for the benefit of those who are now beginning to look at this model, it is important that the remit of influence is limited. One, within capability, you cannot become a soldier overnight. It takes time for you to become a military man, a soldier who is prepared for war. That's number one. Number two, you cannot become a master in weaponry overnight. It takes a lot of building blocks for you to become a master in the use and application of a weapon, irrespective of its caliber. Whether it is a, whether it is a firearm or a small arm or a light weapon or a heavy caliber weapon. It takes time for you to master its operation. Number three, you cannot become a regimented outfit overnight, where respect for hierarchy is what determines your response to tasking and responsibility. So quasi-security arrangements must take cognizance of the fact that you must relinquish your pride and place and allow the rules as set for you to superintend over your conduct. Now, fourthly, you cannot ascribe a capability to yourself, whereas you know that you have a limitation. So you don't confront a small arms and light weapons with a firearm. A firearm has a limitation in terms of range. The maximum a firearm can go is 50 meters. That is the pump action. Whereas an AK-47 can go effectively up to 600 meters. Effectively. So you are just wasting your time and energy thinking that you are confronting somebody who has that kind of capability. But what do you do is that you can be what do you call it? A back channel for regular forces to conduct their operation. And in that, those that are within the fringes of your space become vulnerable. Without firing a shot, you can easily pick those ones. So what happens is that when you look at the olden days vigilante system, who used den guns, bows and arrows in order to provide security within their own local communities, what they were doing was acting more on preventive measures, using people to give them intelligence. So there was a huge investment in asset management. When I mean asset management, people who are on your information sharing list, who gives you heads up, who gives you early warning, and who tells you about the activities of his neighbor, activities of people within their own communities, their local environment, their street, and things like that. So community policing is akin to this kind of ideology, but we are not imbibing it. So, but this is something that has been in practice. So before a combatant picks his arm to go and join his colleagues, the quasi-security arrangement, if they are given a heads up about the activities of a local. And that's it. When I was in Kontagora as the commander of the Nigerian Army Training Center, which was also my responsibility to provide support to the ongoing operations within the southern tip of Kebbi and Zamfara. And what we did was we invested hugely in information about local communities that were on the fringes of that area. And with the support of some identified key community leaders who were able to pick those who were aiding and abating the activities of bandits in that general area. To the extent that a parent handed over their son to us through that effort. So within that period, we were able to dislocate, disassociate, if I should borrow the language of Juliana, these communities from the activities of bandits over a period of time. So I think what we can also do to create these checks and balance is that right from the inception of this kind of quasi-security arrangement, key stakeholders like us are involved. For instance, one of the states that has just launched its own program, a few weeks before that program, we were in touch with the executive, and we are also now looking at, because they have made their intentions clear that this is what they want to do. Now, along with the relevant security agencies, we will ensure that the right process is followed so that we can keep tab of what is acquired, if at all the authority is granted, where it is kept, if at all that the cantonment is not within military or police facilities, and who is the signatory to each of those, weapons that will be made available. So it has to be tied to the individual. Unlike, this is what happens with military settings. Every soldier, service personnel has a weapon tied to him. It's a basic requirement. So you cannot now have this kind of outfits and then you let it loose. Anybody can just go and pick it and it becomes his personal weapon, and accountability becomes a problem, and proliferation becomes another, a problem. So I think we'll share.
I think you've done justice to that question. So let me move to Juliana. Juliana, I'm worried somehow when we hear that, you've done all this and people still, after the whole process, still go back to either terrorism or any form of any form of being anti-state or carrying arms against the state or against people. So what do you think are the factors leading to all this, where after someone has gone through the process of rehabilitation, reintegration, and suddenly you find out that the person has deserted the community and gone back into the bush?
Yes, thank you. First, recidivism is very challenging because first, how do you measure recidivism, right? Like it's very difficult that actually you can have the real data of how many people have returned to the group. We do know that in the cases of Nigeria, particularly the last 5 years, through this monitoring done by the communities, done by the UN, the numbers were very low, even minor or zero, based on what has been reported by the government. However, there's always a challenge on knowing if actually this data is reliable. And this is why it's so important to keep this conversation going between different MDAs and stakeholders of the process, because one of the challenges, and I will say overall in DDRR, is the data management. In terms of disarmament, when a person demobilizes or disengages and goes through a rehabilitation process, that's the stage of the process where intelligence agencies can gather information that will be useful for the reintegration, to provide the accurate reintegration support. So if they come, for instance, with certain mental health or psychosocial support needs, if they have a preference for skills training that will facilitate for them the reintegration, but if they receive a skills training that then won't be used in the location where they will return, all of this information is gathered during the first stages of the DDRR. So that's why it's so important that there's a connection. And then that rehabilitation is well done, that they receive, in the case, for instance, of Nigeria, proper religious counseling, that they receive a family from a visit from their family or the community leaders, and have like a previous contact with them before returning to the communities, and that they receive a skills training in something that will guarantee that they will have an income, a livelihood, returning to the communities. And it's very challenging in many countries, because some of these individuals are returning to locations where there's already a humanitarian crisis. So they have challenges to reintegrate with their families, which they might perceive them as a burden for resources that are already low in terms of, access to shelter, access to food, etc. So that's why a plan on rehabilitation becomes strategic, to give them the tools that they need to guarantee that their integration is sustainable and prevent recidivism. Of course, as I mentioned, it works like an ecosystem. So you see the individual, and that individual has connection with their families, connection with their communities, but also connection with their state. and a connection and an individual needs in terms of resources. All of that needs to take into account and planned by state governments in terms of rehabilitation, so that reintegration is sustainable. So it's all connected. And of course, there's what has been reported in some of the research, not only in Nigeria, but in many countries, is families and that connection with the societies and the communities is one of the most of the important things and the pull factors to keep going on reintegration. If they feel rejection, reintegration might not be successful. And this is why we need to sensitize communities and explain how reintegration works and how second opportunities should be given.
Thank you so much. Then, Erika, I'm worried about this, and I think I might ask you the question and see how you address it. In most conflict zones in Africa, there's this problem of management of weapons and ammunition. They normally refer to as weapon and ammunition management of stockpiles. Why is it a problem for us, especially in Africa, especially in conflict zones? Is it that we don't have the right skills, or that there are other factors apart from issues of capability that leads to situation where either you have missing arms and all that?
How long do I have to answer this? If we briefly, the challenge is multifaceted. Part of it is that much of the energy has gone into strategic stockpiles at the state level as well as the donor level, and not so much on the tactical and operational stockpiles. That doesn't mean it's absent from people's expertise or knowledge, but in terms of the energy that's gone in the last 10 years plus, the strategic stockpiles have been focused. On the challenges, you're correct. It's layered. If you have a fixed site in which the stockpiles are well managed at a battalion's base or a headquarters or a forward operating base, and if they come under attack, and it's seized, it's overrun, which happens frequently in many conflict scenarios, then those well-stored weapons will be at the disposal of the perpetrators of the attack. And that is something that needs to be unpacked. Why is it that you have an incident where there's an attack where you have dozens that are injured or killed, casualties, and then many multiples of dozens of people who are missing, who have fled into the bush? And that needs to be appreciated. That's why when I started in the opening remarks and I talked about the need to engage security sector governance and reform, the focus of this is purely a WAM, weapons and ammunition management issue, or physical security stockpile management, PSSM issue, won't get to the root of many significant challenges. And that has to do with training, leadership, morale issues, payment. And that's why I asked how much time is there to answer this simple question, this quick question, because there's so much that goes into it to unpack it and understand it. Again, this is certainly something that has been a challenge in the Northeast in Nigeria context, but again, it's not a Nigerian problem. It's a problem across much of the continent, and it's not limited, of course, to Africa, but there are a lot of African conflicts in which this dynamic has taken place. So let me stop there in the interest of time.
All right. To the audience, can you keep sending in the questions? I have the one question here for General Diko. someone is asking, marking up weapons, would that help in mopping up illicit arms in the market?
All weapons are marked anyway. There is no weapon that is in circulation today that is not marked. There is every weapon that comes out of a manufacturing company gets marked. It has its own identification mark and things like that. Now, when you talk about marked weapons and then reducing a proliferation of illicit weapons, a marked weapon is what also constitutes an illicit weapon, provided it is not legitimately acquired. So if you own up that you are in possession of a weapon, has not in any way reduced an illicit weapon from being in circulation. What they have only done is we have succeeded in giving us an identity to a weapon, and we can be able to trace that weapon to the owner. And you can also help us by, through that to know the means by which you acquired it. And then we can now also begin to identify the network that you used in order to acquire that weapon. In that case, we will also be able to know who the weapon manufacturer is, and you will help us a great deal in instituting a legal process by which we can bring that illegal process into, the justice system. So what I think you need to do as a way of saying your weapon is marked is to surrender the weapon to the authorities that are legally authorized to hold those weapons. And it completely becomes a weapon removed from circulation, an illicit weapon that has been identified and removed from circulation. But simply marking a weapon and saying it belongs to Mr. A does not in any way diminish the fact that it is an illicit weapon.
Okay, thank you so much. Juliana, I have the next question. I think is directed to you, and the person is asking that IOM seems to concentrate more on people who are the returnees, who may have perpetrated this violence. What are you doing with the communities who are receiving them?
Yeah, this is a question that we received a lot. So our approach, not only in Nigeria, but in the Lake Chad Basin, is what we call a 2-for-1 approach. So for every individual that we support, for instance, with a startup kit, involving them in vocational training, providing MHPS support, we have a two community members for every individual. This is also based on ONSAS, the Office of the National Security Advisor guidelines, and the Ministries of Human Affairs and Social Development, which are the leading agency, at least in Borno State, and the RRR Ministry in Yobe and Adamawa. Moreover, as I mentioned at the beginning, the 4th pillar of our work is community sensitization and community work. So we have many strategies. I'm going to mention just one, which is as part of the social cohesion and reconciliation platforms that we have established already, around 14 of them, which 25 members each. We promote small social impact projects. This has been done in coordination with other agencies. So we sit down with the community members. We do an exercise of training around what is DDRR, transitional justice mechanisms, traditional justice mechanisms, promoting sensitization, and between them, they design a project in the community that they want to implement with the former associates that are returning to the communities. And we do strategies as cash for work for those community members. So we have done a women's center in Goza. We have implemented the rehabilitation of markets in Pulca. And all of our work is around this, and any support that we provide that has an approach. If it's direct support, for instance, a startup kit, or as I mentioned, psychosocial support, that has a 2-for-1 approach. But we also have an overall community sensitization and promoting that social cohesion in the communities. This is also always done, led by the state governments and the federal government. So there's also a lot of work with NGOs and INGOs, civil society organizations. There's now a network of civil society organizations for the Lake Chad Basin. which is led by the Lake Chad Basin Commission, and is also to bring on board, we train the civil society to implement DDRR so that this can actually be handed over to them. We hope eventually to have an exit strategy, and that DDRR is led by the national and the civil society organizations, especially in contexts where there's no peacekeeping operations as in Nigeria.
Thank you so much. The next question is to Eric. I think this person from the audience is asking, he said, based on the map you shared and the discussion from General Diko on sharing of routes between him and the neighboring states around Nigeria, is there any strategy that can be deployed to see countries with such arms proliferation problem work together?
Okay. Well, yeah, there are frameworks. There's regional frameworks. ECOWAS has 15 member states, and they share information, best practice regularly. The national commissioners or committees on small arms meet. You have a sub-meeting that General Diko mentioned that brings in member states that are, or countries that are not member states of ECOWAS, but are also members of ECAS, the Economic Community of Central African States, and subsections of those two are part of the Lake Chad Basin Commission. So there's all kinds of creative ways to bring together practitioners and share good practice. So there's no shortage of platforms. One of the challenges, I'll just say, is that these frameworks that exist don't always get picked up and operationalized. So there's activities and there's actions. General mentioned about the marking. That's something that is required as part of the ECOWAS Small Arms Convention. But implementation sometimes is not across the board. And this is a challenge for every state. There's many security actors, and then there's civilian actors that have weapons. There's a whole challenge of what to do with craft weapons and how to mark them and keep records, because marking is only one element. Then there's the tracing element, right? The record keeping and the tracing on top of the marking. So the short answer is that there is cooperation, there is information sharing. I think that the states and the donors can do a better job in terms of making additional progress. But that can be said about any such engaged enterprise. I do hope I'm able to take the general up on his offer for this upcoming meeting. But I think it's fair to say that there's no shortage of activities and platforms to share information and cooperation amongst these actors.
Thank you. I have one question, which is a general question. Okay. One question, which is a general question for everyone. And while trying to answer it, you will not make your closing remark. Let me start with Juliana. And my question is, in the event of demobilization, is full mopping up of arms possible? You answer that, and then you can now give us your closing speech.
Again, case-based, right? It depends. I think, of course, this is what we're aiming. Of course, it's our target, but it depends on the planning, on the context. When you're having individual demobilizations, where you're having a peace agreement, it all depends. I will say, with the right planning, with the right stakeholders involved, with the right process, is definitely what we should aim for.
Okay. To you, Eric. In the event of demobilization, do you think we can have a complete, not complete, but something that you could say there's no proliferation of arms in any country?
No. No, I mean, just the sources are so great, the demand is so great. it's an important exercise, and it needs to be done. And it's certainly over the 20 plus years that I've been focused on it, there have been huge improvements. Juliana mentioned the 2-to-1. I had never heard of that approach, but that's a huge improvement over what was done many years ago, in which some of the perpetrators seem to be favored against other members of the community. So you're setting the bar too high if you talk about demobilization totally being effective to reduce these illicit arms, but it's a hugely important component of reducing violence and improving community security.
All right, I think we've done an hour 30 minutes, meaning we've come to the end of the discussion. So I wouldn't want us to stretch more, knowing that people are becoming a bit fatigued with webinar and all that. So we should be stopping here. And I will use this opportunity to thank Ginella for stepping in at this short time. It's nice talking to you, and hopefully I'll see you soon. And Eric, I know surely I'll see you in January when you're here. Gerard Dico it's like we lost him, and of course I'll see him in 2 weeks' time. Thank you to the audience. All your questions are here. I can't answer all of them, but I might send some of them to the panelists. If they reply them, I will send them back to you. And to everyone who joined us, thank you, and see you in our next development discourse.